Welcome to episode 39 of Successful Demo. Each episode analyzes the third and character aspects of one more newly released cards. Kumalo? More like Kumano. We are gonna take a break from the Kumalo episodes as we dive into the remainder of the Whispers of Nalubao pack. Well, not much time to view most of the cards, so instead I'll just introduce the card that I was the most excited about when the spoilers were first cracked open. Remote Enforcement, the new 4-2 HB agenda. This agenda basically reads, you get a free piece of ice on your remote from your R&D. Sure, you have to pay the install cost, but when the rest cost is ignored, how amazing is that, right? It has a very high impact when scored effect, so, you know, really encouraging aggressive, proactive scoring plans, which is absolutely what I love. But I think the best part about Remote Enforcement is that it is not restricted to Bioroids only, leaving a lot of room to experiment with for deck builders like myself. I think this is a very important part of Netrunner to have. I mean, quite a lot of cards recently tend to, have very clear-cut synergies that, reduce the amount of deck building space there is. Something like all the viruses that have been released, like Stealth Breakers, or the D-Res effects. Like, if you're playing a D-Res deck, obviously you're running Zumba, the console. Obviously you're running 419, all that sort of very obvious stuff. Whereas with Remote Enforcement, it's not exactly clear what sort of strategy you should go for, at least not at first sight. But one thing's for sure though, because of the nature of Remote Enforcement, it fits best in an Ice toolbox deck. Kind of think of it as like an SMC for HB. Except that instead of tutoring programs, you're tutoring ice. So you can potentially get the correct ice, or the necessary ice, or the best ice, depending on your matchup with Remote Enforcement, allowing you to play a lot of one-off ice in your deck just for the right moments. So that's pretty cool. But of course, we must keep in mind that at the end of the day, it is competing with other 4-2 agendas for card slots. So let's compare it to the gold standard in corporate sales team. Remote Enforcement has two very clear benefits over sales team. The immediate payoff, which is something that you definitely shouldn't ignore. Having the res cost saved upfront as soon as you score it is a big deal compared to corporate sales team, which only fully pays off after 5 turns. And even if you grab a piece of ice that pays off less than 10 credits, so something with a res cost of fewer than 10 credits, you are still not far behind from sales team, because you are still saving a lot of clicks. Don't forget, Remote Enforcement installs from R&D, so you're actually saving the click to draw from R&D as well as the click to install that said ice from HQ. Essentially, when you install an ice with Remote Enforcement, you're saving 2 clicks. Pretty good. Now, the downsides are that Remote Enforcement is generally less flexible than corporate sales team, despite it being a toolbox card. Because it is restricted to remotes only, your ice will not do anything to defend centrals at all. So that is something important to keep in mind. This is not suitable as a card to show up your centrals. If anything, right after scoring Remote Enforcement, chances are you're giving the runner an opportunity to attack your centrals. It is also very vulnerable to D-Res effects. Speaking of D-Res, Remote Enforcement really hates D-Res effects because your Remote Enforcement effect is basically blanked by one puny D-Res card, and that's never a nice feeling. Right, so all that said, the main advantage of Remote Enforcement being an immediate payoff makes it ideal for rush decks, and that's what we are going to be playing with. In our rush deck, we are going to be playing some very bulky ice. Our gold standard tutors for Remote Enforcement include the 12 to res Shiashi and the 9 to res Fairchild, covering both the high-end spectrum of the barriers and code gates respectively. We have some silver standard options as well, in the event that, say, both Chiashi and Fairchild have been drawn. Don't forget, if the ice is not in R&D, you cannot install and res it for free. In which case, we can take the mid-range code gates in DNA Tracker or Fairchild 3, or we can go with, as what I discussed with the big boy in our Azmari games, Endless Euler, which is just as much a very good piece of rushing ice. So all these ice will really help us in our rush plan, making the remote 9 impenetrable or incredibly taxing. and if they get to the bottom of the server, well, they'll have to deal with an Ash Trace. That seems like the perfect way to build a remote enforcement deck. Now, if you see the remainder of our ice, there are actually very tiny cheap gear checks, and there's a very important reason. We want to have a reasonable number of cheap ice like Vanillas and Enigmas that just end the run, simply because we are a rush deck. We want to play Rashida, yeah, the name kind of gives that away. So these ice will help us defend Rashida. We are not CTM, we are not Argus, we don't have hard hitting news to deter the runner from running our Rashidas early, so we need gear checks to stop the runner from getting them. And Architect, of course, a punishing face check for the sentry side. It's our only sentry that we are running, but it almost always baits out the sentry breaker anyway, because its effect is quite game changing. So this is our full deck list. One thing you'll notice is that unlike most other tier 1 HB decks, we're not actually running MCA Austerity Policy. While that is actually a very powerful card, no doubt about that, unfortunately, or rather, I hold a very unconventional view that MC Austerity isn't really a rush card. If you think about it, MC Austerity requires 2 to 3 turns of cooking in a remote before it can do anything for you. That's too slow. A rush deck wants to win ASAP. Yeah, the name gives it away. So, because of that, I think MC Austerity is just a bit too much on the slow side. If anything, you are setting yourself up for terrible situations where the runner simply waits for your MC Austerity to tick up, then stim hacks into your remote, leaving you with no agenda squad and the runner very well set up. So I don't think MCA fits in this deck. We are just going to score agendas the cold hard way and perhaps cheese out the final one with Biotic Labor. That's the deck. And yeah, let's head into the game, shall we? Alright, I guess we're gonna still see some Kumalo action after all. Well, my opening hand looks phenomenal, but it doesn't actually have the aggressive cards I want. Don't forget, this is a rush deck, so, you know, we actually want to see agendas in our opening hand. Not just any old agenda, we want those remote enforcements, because those are what will propel our game. So at least we draw into a nice central ice in Architect that allows us to defend R&D. And hey, what do you know? Remote enforcement appears at the right time. So we are going to enforce the remote and get the Endless Oiler on it. Now, you notice here that I'm going to play the IPO instead of advancing the remote enforcement. For a very simple reason that I don't want to telegraph it, because they will surely face check it and pay the 6 credits to steal it. Remote enforcement needs to be scored. If it is stolen by the runner, you are losing a very huge advantage. It's like getting a Nisei Mark II stolen from Jinteki. We can't have that happen. So at all costs, I needed to draw it into a second piece of ice, which I did. The DNA tracker, which allowed me to safely advance the enforcement and score myself the enforcement, being able to tutor a big ice here. My choices are Fairchild 4.0 or Shiashi. But I decided to go with Endless Oiler, strangely enough. The reasoning behind this was that I wanted the maximum credit tax on the... I don't know. I think Fairchild 4 would have been a perfect answer here. I'm not sure why I went for the Endless Oiler instead. But in any case, you saw how click efficient we are playing with Asa Group. The remote enforcement trigger on my agenda allowed me to trigger Asa Group to install Rashida from hand, the Rashida that I top decked, and that allowed me to get the Rashida trigger the very next turn. This is super efficient. Super efficient. I can't even begin to stress how awesome that is. So because of that, we now have a bunch of nice cards we can play. Jeeves goes out in the open, which is not a very good idea against Kumalo. It's definitely going to trash it. But we are going to get a second Rashida trigger, so not all is lost. At the very least, it wastes 2 clicks of my opponent's time, one for running archives, the other for checking my Jeeves, and we're going to get the second Rashida off. Pew pew, and we find yet another remote enforcement. That's definitely going in the remote and getting advanced. Euler into DNA Tracker into Euler is a very strong server. One of the reasons I chose Euler as my outer ice was because I wanted all my ice to tax credits. So Endless Euler definitely costs 6 to break. DNA Tracker will sap 6 credits if you do not break it, and the inner oiler requires yet another 6 credits. So a very, very impenetrable server right here. Even a stim hack, can he get through? This is going to be interesting. I'm going to res the oiler here, base 6, going down to 11 credits, DNA tracker. Okay, are you going to let it fire, or are you going to install the Black Orchestra? Oh yeah, he's gonna use Maxwell James there. Maxwell James de-reses the DNA tracker, and he gets past my second oiler and snags the remote enforcement for me. Now the game gets a lot dicier. Yeah, the Maxwell James really turning things in my opponent's favor. I'm not that bummed about losing 8 credits off DNA tracker. I had to do it to bait the Maxwell James. The worst thing was actually getting Agenda stolen. I'm very rich. I had a very good money opening, so I wasn't too bummed about the DNA tracker de-res. I was just sad that the DNA tracker did not get to do its job, which is to tax 6 credits at the very least from my opponent, which would have stopped them from getting the agenda. So here I installed my final Rashida in the remote. Oh man, this chaining of Rashidas is absolutely crazy. This card is so good. It's so powerful in rush decks. We are definitely making the most out of it to make our opponent check our remote so often. They are only on 3 credits now because they just didn't have the time to set up. They've been too busy running our remote and running to check our Jeeves and everything. Thankfully, we don't draw into a whole lot of agendas here. I mean, we've been scoring them pretty aggressively, so we shouldn't expect too many. But now we have a very flooded hand. Asa group will definitely help alleviate us some of this pressure of having too many cards in hand, as we install a Jeeves protected by a single ice. And then we are also going to install Sales Team because we'll probably have to score the agenda if we want to win. The problem here is it has to be telegraphed. No, it doesn't. The Jeeves Motor Baroids can allow us to score a Sales Team from 0, but I'm more worried about my opponent checking my Jeeves and trashing it. I don't want... Jeeves is very easily trashed by Kumalo, especially with Virus Breeding Ground and Data Sucker and Yusuf up. So I should expect the Jeeves to get trashed. All I want them to do is to take the ice tax. They don't even check the Jeeves, so I'm going to get a free Jeeves trigger here. Gonna rest the Jeeves, score the Sales Team, and we are up on 4 points. That's pretty good. And with our extra click, that's the nice thing about having the Jeeves available, is that we can install something on our turn using Lateral Growth, further emptying our hand. This is why I play Lateral Growth in this deck. With 1 click, you can get rid of 2 cards from your hand, allowing you to elevate the otherwise overwhelming amount of card draw this deck has. Rashidas and Ultraviolet Clearances. Can you tell I want to go fast? Yeah, we are running all the draw cards here. Now, NGO Front is in the remote. I think I can bait my opponent out with it, but I must be really careful about how I approach it. At this point, they're still a bit too poor to contest my remote, so I'm not sure if advancing it is the right call here. Right, so it's a very tricky situation. I know that there are 4 agendas left in my deck. 5 actually, 5 agendas. 2 Ikawa project, no sorry, 1 Ikawa project, 3 Vitruviuses, and the last remote enforcement. So keeping that in mind, R&D is actually pretty stacked. It would do me some good to start icing up R&D right here. So Lateral Growth, looking very tempting. The question is which piece of ice. We have Architect, which is nice piece of ice, although they do have the MK Ultra out. So I'm actually installing Architect on Archives here to stop free virus gathering runs. And then I'm going to go for the double advance play, trying to bait them into running my NGO front. They stim hack it. Ooh, this is looking good. Perhaps a better way I could have approached this turn was to triple advance the NGO and then Lateral Growth the Architect with the Jeeves click. That way it would look more like an agenda, less like an NGO front. But either way, my opponent bit the bait. I wasn't too upset even if my opponent didn't run here, because I wanted to get some money with NGO front anyway. But the fact that my opponent even bothers contesting this remote is huge for me. Suffice to say, this looks like the winning agenda from their point of view. I'm on 4 agenda points and there's still Ikawa projects unaccounted for. So they basically had to contest this simply because I was on match point. So that's the beauty of rush decks. You get to match point and suddenly they have to check all your NGOs. That's when they become strongest. So they pay through their nose just to get past all my ice. The DNA tracker actually fired, so they lost 6 plus 6 plus 6 credits, minus a few because they have a lot of virus counters. The Yusuf doing a lot of work here, making that the amount of credit spent mostly equal to the number of credits Stim Hack gave, but they're going to be really disappointed to find out that the Stim Hack run was in vain. Now we play the UVC, now we draw into our agendas. I'm going to install this last remote enforcement here. Seeing that Ikawa project didn't appear, I think we have to go for the score for agendas route. Now, do I advance the remote enforcement? I definitely could, but here I think I chose not to, risking my opponent, basically taking a risk here, hoping my opponent doesn't trash the Jeeves. Instead, I'm going to take the extra click to show up R&D, because there are still 2 agendas unaccounted for, and they could just win off a Hail Mary R&D run. Or I should show up HQ. Sorry, there are 3 agendas in R&D. So the agenda density in R&D and HQ are roughly the same. 1 in 5 for both. 3 in 14 for R&D, 1 in 5 for HQ. Right? There are 6 agendas out in play, 3 in the deck. I had to decide between icing R&D or icing HQ. I went with HQ because the runner was more likely to run HQ than R&D. All things equal. Because the architect was res, so they knew they could get into HQ for a constant 3 credits. That was a known factor. I did not want to give them that. Instead, I want them to perhaps make a misplay by not running the unknown ice on R&D. So we'll see how that works out. Right? In any case, if they don't trash the Jeeves here, I'm going to win in 2 turns time. First turn, as you're about to see here, score the remote enforcement with extra Jeeves click. And my next turn, I'm simply going to fast advance the Vitruvius from hand with the Baltic Labor. The remote enforcement here is a bonus. This was a mistake I made here. I searched my deck for an ice before realizing that this ice could only be placed on the remote. This is useless. The problem with my play is that I'm reducing the number of cards in R&D by 1. Right, that's a problem, right? Because now the chances of hitting this random agenda on R&D has just increased. 3 in 13 became 3 in 12, but thankfully they whiffed, so I was able to close out the game with the final Vitruvius. It was a lot closer than it should have been. The early agendas sniped by my opponent really helped them get into the game, but alas, they did not have the multi-access needed to close out the game reliably, despite being on match point at the end of the game. That's what happens when you stuff your Kumalo deck with viruses and not game-winning multi-access cards. So I've actually played this matchup several times, or rather this deck, both against James Gray's Kumalo as well as against other runner decks, and I found a stunningly consistent pattern amongst all these games, in that if I don't score remote enforcement early, or I don't find a Rashida early, I just lose steam. I can't do anything. It's kind of like the Ginger Grid experimentation days where your deck is phenomenal if you find Ginger Grid on turn 1 or 2, and if you don't, you are just a shitty Glacier deck. That's exactly how this deck feels, because you have all these big eyes, the Chiyashi, the Fairchild, that if you draw into them, you're like, dang, I can't, these eyes are blank, because I'm not going to hard res them, that's way too expensive, and they are no longer in R&D for me to tutor. Sure, you can include some shuffle effects in your deck, but you know, we only have 49 cards here. What makes this worse actually is that the deck doesn't have that many forward tempo cards. I mean, we have Rashida, we have the remote enforcement, but that's it. There are lots of cards in the deck that are like, you know, hot potatoes that you don't really want to score, but you know, they're just in your hand and you really want to get rid of them, like the Vitruviuses and the defensive Ikawas. Those are just filler agendas to close out the game. You really don't want to see them early because they clog up your HQ, and you really don't want to score them early because they do nothing. They don't give you the remote enforcement benefit. So this is a big problem with this deck. It's very, very draw dependent. This video may have been a glorification of this deck, but make no mistake, when it gets a bad draw, things get really rough. Speaking of glorification, I think I had a very good matchup against James Gray's Kumalo, which wasn't running Tripano. The main thing about this deck is that it really hinges on its regular ice, the ice that you can afford to res in the opening turns, and by that I'm looking straight at you, Endless Euler. There's a reason I spent 6 influence running 3 copies of these. The big boy was right when he said that it was a rush ice. It's very, very much hands down one of the best pieces of ice that I can splash for in this sort of deck. like you saw this game, the remote enforcement that I scored, the very first thing was so easy to score because it was protected by an endless Euler. Even by itself, it wasn't enough. I needed either a gear check or a credit sapper in DNA tracker, as was the case, to guarantee the score. So your regular ice is important. This deck isn't defined by the Chiyashi, the Fairchild 4. It's defined by all these workhorse ice that get the enforcement out in the first place. So that's a very important point to keep in mind. And because of that, because I'm so reliant on Endless Euler, this deck also fails if I go up against a matchup where Endless Euler is blank. Like against a Morningstar Anarch, Sherman Sunny, you know, all these stuff. Or even tools that get you past Euler cheap, like Bypass, like Security Nexus, de-resing is very annoying, and of course, Apocalypse is a huge pain to any remote enforcement deck because you're not reinforcing your centrals, the runner can Apocalypse you. So yeah, all in all, if I were to give a review of remote enforcement and agenda, I would say it's very, very strikingly similar to Nisei Mark II from Jinteki in that they serve the same purpose in rush decks, help you score the next agenda, push you forward. The key difference between these two is that remote enforcement tapers off as the game goes on, while Nisei Mark II scales into the late game because the power of the end run token is proportional to the taxation power of the ice that your remote on your remote, whereas remote enforcement gives you a burst gain of 2 clicks. As I said, tutoring a piece of ice from your deck and installing it is basically saving 2 clicks and about 10 credits from the res. This 2 click plus 10 credit gain is super significant in the early turns, but in the late turns it doesn't really mean much when when the runner's drip economy and their engine has generated double digits in credits and efficiency. So yeah, if you want to play remote enforcement, just keep that in mind. It really needs to be a fast and furious deck. Now let's do a new section to our successful demos. Let's talk about combos and non-bos, starting with Asa Group. As you saw this game, I was so glad I got to feature this. Asa Group is a nice combo with remote enforcement, because on the turn you score remote enforcement, typically with a triple advance. You can't do anything else, you waste your Asa Group trigger. But nope, because remote enforcement installs an ice for you after you score it, which allows you to then install an upgrade or an asset from your hand into the same server. In this case, the Rashida. That was huge, giving me that Rashida trigger 1 turn earlier. Another combo is Nyx Ice, which wasn't featured in this deck at all. I actually considered putting Nyx Ice in this deck, mixing up all the big ice like Shiashi and the standard Nyx Ice suite, because remote enforcement gives you the option to just add 1 more Nyx Ice onto the table, making all the Nyx Ice, including those on your centrals, that much more dangerous. I eventually deviated from that because I found that as a rush deck, I tend to finish games where I only have 3 or maximum 4 ice rest. So, the game just ends before next ice even gets to the point of relevance. So why play next ice in that scenario? I didn't find any reason to. But maybe you can. It is still a good combo, and it would definitely play remote enforcement as next ice synergy over Nyx Wave 2 any day. Any day. Now, let's talk about nombos. Archer's a nombo with remote enforcement. If you see the text at the bottom here, even though remote enforcement ignores the res cost of your ice, it does not ignore the additional cost to res Archer. So if you use remote enforcement on Archer, you don't have to pay the 4 credits, but you still have to forfeit the agenda, which is a very bad trade. So this is not a combo, unlike with other free res mechanics such as Mutate, such as Eliza's Toy Box, such as Priority Requisition. Another combo is Ginger City Grid. Even though these two cards do virtually the same thing, it is overkill in my opinion. Ginger City Grid already stacks a remote deep enough as it is. You don't really need remote enforcement's effect to add to that. If anything, what you need is more money to rest said ice on the remote, in which case sales team will help you a lot more than the enforcement. Now that being said, if you plan to use your Ginger City Grid on a different server, something like R&D, and dedicate your remote ice rezzing to remote enforcement, then there might be some merit in this. So that's about it. All in all, remote enforcement, as you can see by this video, is a very flexible card with lots of room to explore, lots of potential, and you know, this video doesn't do it justice. I'm sure there are many other ways, creative ways, which you can come up with to make remote enforcement work. So I hope that you all take this as a spark, as an inspiration point to get down to making your own remote enforcement decks. As I said, this is the card that got me excited the most in the newest pack, and I hope I've made you excited about it too. Thanks for watching a Happy Net Running. I'll see you next time. Ciao.